Hello and welcome to Sustainability Leads, the podcast where we bring you insightful conversations with South African leaders. I'm your host, Dr. Achieng Ojuang, the Executive Director of the Global Compact Network, South Africa. I have the pleasure this morning to introduce our guest, Ms. Kathleen Ebersohn-Khuvutlu, who is the Head of Sustainability at the Land and Agricultural Development Bank, South Africa. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Achieng.
Kathleen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I will just give a bit of background onto who Kathleen is. Kathleen is a seasoned sustainability practitioner who has worked in the sector since 2016 and has been there since the evolution from compliance to really driving impact on corporate sustainability. So Kathleen, welcome again. Really great to have you here. But beyond your title, who is Kathleen?
Thanks so much, Achieng, and thank you for this necessary conversation. I think it's high time that we have conversations on sustainability in South Africa so that we're leading from a global South perspective. I am a mom and a wife, first and foremost. I work currently at the Land Bank, absolutely, and have worked in the finance sector as a sustainability practitioner for the last 10 years. I have particular interests in inequality, climate change, gender issues, and I know that you and I have had a lot of robust discussions on those issues. So it's such a privilege to be here. I also am a former UNGC South Africa Network board member. So it feels like a full circle moment for me to be back with you.
Absolutely. And it's been many years that you have been leading or supporting sustainability in various corporates. And I know that, transformation for South Africa is a big part of sustainability. We can't claim to be sustainable if we are not transformed. And yet, if you look at the data that we have, especially from the employment equity, the private sector has been slower in transforming, especially when you compare the private sector to the public sector. What are your insights on this? Why and what needs to be done?
I think transformation is difficult, and I think that systemic change, because that's effectively what we're talking about, is difficult. I do believe that our economy is a monopoly economy. So in every sector we have 5 to 8 big players, and there is not necessarily the willingness to increase that pool. And I think that a big part of this, in my view in any case, is steeped in our history. I don't think that we come out of our history of colonialism and apartheid easily. I think that those sorts of, that kind of system around oppression, and when we talk about oppression, we're speaking about it from an economic perspective, an educational perspective, a social perspective, though that's been going for over 300 years. So ultimately, what does it look like 30 years down the line once we've received like kind of the advent of democracy? I think change is difficult, and I think the willingness to kind of share what we believe is a finite pie is difficult. So I think that there does require to be a complete and utter disruption, and I don't know what that ultimately looks like. I think that I'm part of that Simunya generation, right, where we were told we were a rainbow nation and really the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and like we're going to air our stories, but there was actually no social justice. And unfortunately, I think that 30 years down the line, what we're seeing is serious discontent and proper inequality. I think we are the most unequal society in the world. We've overtaken Brazil. So we know that the Simunye Rainbow Nation kind of rhetoric does not work. And I think it has to be accompanied by real social justice and economic redress. And that, I think, is going to be hard won, because I don't think that the willingness around real distribution is there.
And just taking you back a little bit, how did you end up in corporate sustainability?
So this is an interesting question. I came out of doing my master's in sociology at Wits, and I worked in the health space as a researcher for a while, and then went off on my own and was doing a series of research work. And I was commissioned to do some work by Discovery in Orange Farm around a community needs assessment. And I thought that the way in which they were rethinking corporate social investment at that particular time was really interesting. Instead of going in with a kind of initiative that they wanted to kind of presuppose that the community would be grateful for, they were very clear at that time that they actually wanted to get a sense of what were the community needs. So it was a very different way of thinking about corporate social investment, in pausing first and asking the question around, what does this community want and need, and where are we able to meet them? And if we're not able to meet them, do we have partners within our ecosystem who can come in and meet the needs of that community? So I conducted the needs assessment, and I think the work went really well. And they asked me to join them on a more full-time basis, first and foremost as a monitoring and evaluation officer in corporate social investment. And I was probably there for about a year and then moved on to sustainability. I felt at that time sustainability was opening up a series of conversations around the actual operating model, the actual engine of the business, and not necessarily an appendage, as in the corporate social investment arm. What is the actual operating model, the engine of the organization, doing for society and environments at large? What impact are they having? And it poses a question, which is actually quite an uncomfortable question in business boardrooms, around what is your responsibility as a business. And I've kind of seen over the last almost 10 years a shift in that understanding, where I think before businesses were aware that they operated within a context, but were able to buffer themselves from that context. And I think it's not surprising in a way, because I think as South African citizens, specifically in a middle class and upper class environment, you buffer yourself from the context in which we live all the time. We don't access public health. Our children are often not in public schools. We have private security, and we live often in gated communities. So we don't think about our context or our interfacing with our context in a very real way. And I think that the conversation has really radically changed since the pandemic. And that was really interesting for me. So fast forward to 2020, the conversation automatically was different. There was Black Lives Matter. Yeah. There was a pandemic that fundamentally made a business realize that, oh, we actually do operate directly within our context, and that our context can have severe impact on our business. And we need to be thinking about that relationship all the time. Sorry, that was a very long-winded response.
That's really got me thinking.
Yeah.
And I remember in 2018, I was going to Pretoria, and at that time we were saying South Africa is facing a pandemic.
Yes.
The gender-based violence pandemic, even before COVID hit. When you look back into the corporate sector, how are we dealing with gender-based violence as corporates?
I don't think we are, to be honest. Perhaps there are anomalies and outliers, and absolutely I'm happy to be corrected there. But I think we are struggling. I think that there's an easy and quick disassociation. And Acheng, I can't help but think back to the fact that as South African citizens who are in the corporate world, right, talking about us not as professionals but as personal individuals, we are desensitized and removed from our context. So while we are driving to work in our car, not necessarily even taking public transport, driving in our car, we see that there's inequality on the streets, we see that there's homelessness, we see all of these things, but there's a very easy way that we disassociate. So if we're able to do that in our personal capacity, we are certainly doing that in our professional capacity. And I think that with regards to GBV, that is certainly the case, that GBV remains an issue that is a very personal and intimate issue. And I think that often the onus is on women. So how are you being responsible? How are you behaving? Where were you? Who were you with? Who was your partner? And less a conversation that is centered and driven and I mean by driven by men, because I think that that's what needs to happen. And while I think I do see changes in the kinds of conversations that men are having, certainly in like podcasts and on radio, I think that we're not at the point yet where a business is able to say, how do we integrate an understanding of gender and an understanding of gender-based violence into the way in which we are dealing with our people, managing our people. Yeah.
Because it does also manifest.
Absolutely.
At the workplace, just
Absolutely.
in different ways. And so companies cannot say it doesn't happen here. It happens maybe out there in the community where our employees come from. But then again, you have to say, but then how do I ensure the well-being? Is it even within my control to be able to ensure the well-being of employees? Are there specific things that companies can do to ensure the welfare and the well-being of employees beyond just the four walls of the office?
I think there are definitely things, but I think it also is interesting because I think that these things are practitioner-led. So I'm thinking about Woolworths.
Yeah.
And Woolworths has got what they're actually calling a social justice institute, or I'm butchering it terribly, but they've got a really interesting program that they're running, but it's being driven by a particularly dynamic individual who is aware of the kinds of challenges that the employees across the Woolworths organization are facing, and who's then integrating it into multiple different programs, whether it be breastfeeding rooms for their tellers, so that tellers are not sitting with engorged breasts halfway through their shift. They're able to excuse themselves and be excused within their context, or whether it be even around naming. Because for a long time in the retail sector, we've seen that Black women, often women, have had to take on a Christian name in order for them to be more relatable to the customer. And Woolworths is saying, actually, no further. We're going to call people by their God-given name. And people need to learn, and that's around integration. I think what I'm saying is small changes within a workplace can mean big things. I have come into contact with workplaces where it is not appropriate to speak vernacular on the open floor, right?
Oh,
what does that ultimately mean? You're asking people who work for you to leave a part of themselves at the door. And I think that, again, it's small things like the ability for a person to show up as their full self and access the care that they need, that meets them where they are, and not care that's prescribed in a boardroom outside of the context of the employer that they're trying to solve for. There has to be that interface and that engagement with your employees all the time to say, what are the challenges that you are facing, and how can we tailor not our interventions, but the services that we are able to give to you to meet you where you are?
Absolutely. And glad that you mentioned the incremental or the little positive things that certain companies are doing. I think for us, the issue is sustainability or the welfare of people should not be a competitive thing within the private sector. And so if there's one company that is getting it, if there's one company that is putting out a model of good practice around one of or solve these issues, then we want them to open source it. We want more companies to come in and say, that is a model that is working. How do we amplify it? Because what we are looking for is big impact that can change people's lives. How do we get companies to rally together and work together when there's a model of good practice that one company has already modeled?
So I would hesitate to say the reason why I have stayed in private sector for 10 years is because there hasn't been competition actually within sustainability practitioners. And I have found sustainability practitioners across the private sector, specifically around meeting points like the United Nations Global Compact, like others, right? Associations that bring a collective together, that there's a real willingness to share and share various different models. I think the difficulty is that I almost feel like sometimes practitioners need and want a model that they can take and replicate. And a model will never successfully work. I think what I'm saying is that, yes, it's small iterative changes, but it's a constant feedback loop around what is the context that you're operating in? What is the nuances? What are your employees saying? And they may not be saying the same in other organizations because contexts differ, right? And there are nuances. So I think it's fine to understand what other people are doing. But I do think that actually the role of a sustainability practitioner, and certainly an executive, is to listen more and to hear what your context is saying, and to also listen for the changes, because changes do happen, right? So the pandemic was a huge change, a huge disruption. But more than that, I think that you're wanting that constant feedback loop to say, what is our context asking of us, and how do we show up for that? And you can then say, what are best practice? What are the principles that we should be applying? What are the various different frameworks? Those things kind of integrate into your thinking and your approach. But I think that you are needing to kind of really tailor and listen. And I think that that's hard in dealing with complex issues like sustainability.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the specific issue of gender equality at work in all its manifestations. And I know that this work, the fruits that we are seeing now, has come on the shoulders of women activists out there, feminists actually, for many years, pushing for change and pushing for inclusion. Is there an acknowledgement of where this is coming from? Is the private sector, do companies locate and acknowledge where the transformation has come from?
No.
And is that playing a role right now?
Playing a role how? Well, how do you mean?
In the change, in the little steps, in the little successes that we may be experiencing now. I mean, 50 years ago, many countries, women didn't have the vote. Now we have. We were not accepted in certain spaces. Now we are. But what normally bothers me is that it's not located, it's not always acknowledged where the struggle has come from. What is your experience at the moment in the corporate space in terms of what drives that change?
What drives that change? I think it's a visionary leader, and often that leader is a male. And I think that it's when a leader has gone through a personal transformation, a personal paradigm shift, that they can bring complex issues such as how do we mainstream gender equality into our organization. You'll often find that it emanates from them having a daughter and them seeing something around how their daughter is interacted with that they don't like, and then changing, or their daughter being particularly vociferous as they become teenagers and young women. That they then bring a slightly different thinking. It's often not the wife, just to say, but they bring a slightly different thinking into the boardroom, right? But I think, Acheng, to your point, I don't think we acknowledge our history, full stop. Not just around gender, not around activism. I read a fantastic and interesting post recently by a Fees Must Fall activist. And she was saying, it's so interesting to see in real time their narrative of that particular struggle being completely erased and rewritten. And I think we're seeing it in multiple different spaces. I don't think we acknowledge activism, even if activism becomes mainstream. I don't think we acknowledge specific activists. My husband and I were actually talking about it today. We erase them, whether it be through actual assassinations and or narrative assassinations, where they're just completely rewritten. We saw that with Winnie Madikizela Mandela as well, right? Yeah. So I think I don't think that we are good at remembering our history. I don't think that we're good at commemorating our history. When I look at the ways in which we have commemorated our immediate history of the anti-apartheid movement, putting up a bronze sculpture of Mandela is the most unimaginative way to do it. And I feel like we often go that course and we won't necessarily do proper discourse where actually it's also okay to not make a statement. It's also okay for you to leave a monument that raises more questions than it answers. And I feel like we're in a generational kind of milieu at the moment where we are all seeking convenience. We want the neat answer. And let me tell you guys, there is no neat answer. For where we find ourselves as a country, where we find ourselves as a globe, we are in a complex intersection of a number of problematic issues, be they neoliberalism, be they a backlash to sustainability, be they a global north versus global south perspective. And I am saying pointedly versus. We're not in a collaborative space at the moment. And I think that we as a generation, a younger generation, I can't even put myself in that anymore actually, but as a younger generation, we have to be more comfortable with the fact that there are no neat answers. And that what complexity requires us to do is to do the next right best thing. And that's iterative small steps all the time, right? It's not, unfortunately, these large scale, big impact goals. It isn't, because it just can't be, because we've got to be listening all the time for what our context is asking of us. And if it requires us to slightly alter things, to change, I mean, think about how nature operates. And I have been particularly inspired, and I know that this is very strange, because before I was very much around people. I was a people-centric practitioner. The older I get, the more aware I am. I'm very excited about the nature-related conversations. Less around the climate change, because I think climate change has been hijacked by global north. They are prescribing how we should be thinking about things, right? But nature is inspiring, because when you look at like biomimicry in a sustainability context, nature is showing us how we should be interacting all the time. And what does that mean? It means being deeply aware of what context you're in, listening for that context, and then doing the next best thing that context is asking of you.
Absolutely, and that is making me think about how we value and rely on traditional knowledge as well. But you're talking about complexities, you're talking about a backlash, and I'm thinking that sustainability right now is at a point in time, I don't think in the last 20 years, we have received this level of a backlash. What impact is this having on companies in South Africa?
So you and I were talking about this just before we started recording. I think it's creating a muted language around sustainability, first and foremost. So where you'll hear companies saying quietly in boardrooms, we are doing the work, we're just not going to call it sustainability, right? Because they see that this work is necessary work, and our planet and our people are in crisis, and we actually do need to do things to get us to a next phase, a higher consciousness, if you like. But I think that beyond that, my interest has been, why are we centering the entire narrative around the backlash to sustainability around one country? And that's been fascinating for me, because I do think that what that requires is, I would like to decenter that. I would like to look at places, to your point from earlier, where companies are continuing to do the work and are calling it sustainability and are doing the necessary, showing up in the necessary ways in order for us to make the planet greener, make the planet more sustainable, make our organizations more equal, because they recognize that there's a relevance to doing that. There's a sustainable, absolutely a sustainable need for their organization and their personal livelihood in order for them to do that. So I do think it's so interesting for me, and I wonder if we didn't have social media and we didn't have devices on in our hand, right? The people who we often listen to are the ones that are making the loudest noise. But it's not necessarily the people who are saying the most substantial things. And if we had to start like decentering that and saying, cool, hear it, but let's rather amplify this particular narrative, I think it would start to change, and not even change, it's not even about changing the discourse, it's just about silencing the things that don't actually make sense. But I think it has made the work of practitioners and sustainability practitioners really difficult. Because what you're then walking into is 20 years of gained traction. You go into a boardroom and you have the one board member who asks, is ESG not dead? Surely ESG is dead. And where are they getting their stuff? It's clickbait.
Yeah. So we are in that era where we are doing the right thing, but are afraid to acknowledge that sustainability is actually the way to go. You've been a board member, a director of the board of the UN Global Compact Network South Africa for 7 years, maybe more. You were with us when we transitioned into an independent network of the UN Global Compact. That brings me to the issue of governance and what your own experience has been serving the collective in the collective space through the network.
So specifically through the network, it's been one of my great privileges and honors. When I joined the network, obviously we were all serving under Nozipho January Bardil, and she is an extraordinary person and an extraordinary woman with a very clear intention around equality, a clear intention around sustainable practices. And I think that we as South Africa have been very lucky that she served on a lot of prominent boards, right? So I do think from a South African perspective, I think with Mervyn King and the fact that we are further along in terms of an integrated reporting process and what that kind of, the consequences of that within an organization, the kinds of conversations that happen. But I also think that thinking about transformation, to your point, even though I think the gains haven't been parallel to the inputs, right, for a range of different reasons, the reality is that transformation has brought a lot of uncomfortable conversations that have been needed to have had into the boardroom. So I do think from a governance perspective, my sense from a sustainability practitioner sense is that we are in a very different context around governance issues than other parts of the world. Actually, our governance structures are fairly good and fairly robust. Yeah. That being said, I do think there has been an interesting dip, I want to say, in governance, I think across the board. I kind of put it down to perhaps post-pandemic, that we're all coming out of a very different way, a huge disruption that's taken place. We haven't actually been able to have a moment to pause and really think about and reflect on that disruption and what that has ultimately meant for us as organizations, for us as people. People have lost people. Yeah. There's been huge amounts of trauma in the last 5 years that I just think we have not had an opportunity to process. So I think that perhaps the governance rooms are a little bit more empty than they were previously. Yeah. But I do think that South Africa is at a point where, and I think this is not a South African issue actually, I think that this is a global issue, where we have some hard decisions to make.
Yeah, interesting that you bring in the pandemic. If you think about it, we never even had time to grieve because it was so much. Yeah. As one person, you knew so many people and so many families that had been affected. And then that takes us back to the issue of how have those families that were deeply affected coped? And how has that been weaved into the conversation, into the planning going forward? Is there any consideration at all of the impact of the pandemic on families and workspaces?
Huge issues there, huge issues. I think you're right. We have not had a moment to pause and think and mourn and grieve and process the pandemic itself, right? Because there's been, on one hand, from a leadership perspective, a need, an understanding and a reckoning of our economy and where our economy is at within the broader global landscape, right? And the need to keep pushing and to keep your profitability high, keep productivity high, and that's totally valid. On the other hand, there's also been a sense around constant precarity. So your employees are feeling like they're one paycheck away from poverty and or one paycheck away from losing their job, because we have seen huge restructuring coming out of the pandemic. That goes without saying. So I think that this level of kind of social and economic precarity more broadly, or instability, has really meant that organizations and individuals have not had the time to sit back and really process the fact that we've come out of a global event that was massive. and I don't know how that processing happens. Is it a series of academics who are doing kind of a study that then it becomes think pieces in the media that then we're looking back in 30 years and then thinking about it? I don't know if that processing happens very intimately within a household and you grieve, but there is also the imminent need of you still need to earn money. You still have to go out into the world and get your paycheck. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, now back to you as a person. What drives you? What motivates you? You've been doing this work for a long time. What keeps you going?
I am driven by curiosity. I've always been a very curious person, and I love the fact that I can ask a series of questions. I'm always the one who's normally asking questions, not answering them. I'm driven by justice. I think ultimately I feel a bit like a toddler in that regard, where the notion that things are not fair is enough to get up in the morning and do the work.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that I believe that I can make things fair, because I also think you have to be clear as an individual that you're operating within a broader system. And sometimes that system is rigged, unfortunately. But it does mean that you show up every day and you do what you possibly can within your sphere of influence in order to make the world marginally better than how we found it. I'm also driven by, and I know it's cliche, but becoming a mom, I want my kids to walk into a world that is a little bit more equitable. I'm raising boys. I want my boys to be good men in the world. And what that ultimately looks like is I want them to see a mother who also contributes to the household. I want them to be okay with being challenged, and which is interesting, right? Because masculinity is fragile from birth. But you want your kids to be like, no, mama's going to ask you these hard questions, and it doesn't mean you have to answer them now, but it does mean that you have to go back and think about them and try for an answer, and that's also okay, you know. So I think fundamentally my passion comes from curiosity, the willingness to learn, and wanting to contribute.
In this shaping of young boys, is it okay to fail? How do you teach them that?
Is it okay to fail? So this is interesting.
Because that is not what society is going to teach boys.
And I feel like that's what I really struggle with, because we do all this work as mothers, right? I know, as a fellow boy mom.
Yes.
And then you send them out into the world and they learn different things. And then you look like the idiot for the next 15 years or whatever, until perhaps they have their own kids, and then they come back and they're like, okay, I can kind of see where you were at. But I hear you. I think that is a big thing, like that it's okay to fail. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to foster friendships that go beyond like monosyllabic answers. You know, like you can have deep conversations as boys.
Yeah.
But I think that those things are super difficult to do in a society that attributes value elsewhere.
Corporate sustainability, or sustainability more broadly, is very relatable to many people. It is relatable because it's about people, it's about the planet or the environment around us, it's about our economy. And so there could be a young person out there thinking, I'd want to be a corporate sustainability specialist. I want to work within that landscape. What advice would you give a young person interested?
So I think, and it's interesting that you say this, because there has been, I think with the acceleration of sustainability as it's been adopted over the last 5 years, there has been more interest shown specifically by young people, and I'm starting to see a lot of research students who are MBA students, master's students, postgraduate students who are starting to play in that space and think about what would a career look like, who are reaching out. And I think a critical thing for me is to be curious, to ask questions, to be comfortable to have courageous conversations, and I think that often young people are best placed to do that, and to ask critical questions, to ensure that they have interpersonal skills, because I think that interpersonal skills are what get you traction within a sustainability space. It is about knowing how to have conversations, knowing when to have conversations as well, and what conversations would be appropriate within that context, but also relationships are critical within this field. And then I think a big thing is, because I think a lot of what I've said over the last while has been around complexity. That can feel quite scary and daunting for a young person. So I think within the space, it's probably best placed for you to start with broader frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, such as the UNGC principles. I think that those are really interesting starting off points that can pique your curiosity and can get you to ask a series of questions. But what I have found most helpful in the early parts of my career in learning the space has been around disclosure requirements, weirdly enough. And I know no one wants to talk about them because they can feel very compliance driven. But the disclosure compliance requirements, such as your Global Reporting Initiative, now GRI, TCFD, IFRS or ISSB S1 and S2, and now TISFD, TNFD, are particularly interesting because what they ultimately allow you to do is to ask questions within a formulaic way and start to track the data that's coming in that will ask more questions effectively. And I find that structure has certainly helped in framing conversations at an executive level and at a board level. It certainly has given me insight into an organization over a period when you're tracking over a period of time and you have a level of comparable data. But also it's allowed an organization to understand where they fit within the broader scope of things, because to a much earlier point of yours around competitiveness, the private sector is competitive and with good reason, right? That's where a lot of innovation comes from, a lot of productivity and performance comes from. So I think that the disclosures that I've listed kind of give private sector a sense as to where are they as opposed to their peers. And that's been a really useful conversation to drive changes within the organization. And unfortunately, and I know that a lot of people will say that reporting happens at the tail end of a process, and it does. But often that tail end of a process can drive a further process. So unfortunately, I have found that reporting can be the tail that wags the dog. And it should be the other way around. But often reporting has allowed me to show even your execs that this is what your employees feel. They don't feel psychologically safe, or they are absent for more days than is what is globally comparative. What's going on here? And then you can have a series of conversations afterwards. So I would definitely say to a young person, start off with a reporting base, because reporting can give you the insights necessary to have further conversations in a structured way within your organization that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and because when you are reporting and disclosing, you come across gaps that need further action.
Absolutely.
You get to understand where the company is doing well. And so it's a learning opportunity to do reporting. But would you say that to become a sustainability practitioner, you must have an activist born in you?
100%. Why else are we doing this? I thought I made that clear from the beginning. But no, absolutely. I think you've got to be somebody who wants to make a change. And that's difficult, you know. I've heard a lot of conversations. I actually have never heard this in an accounting frame, an actuary frame, any other profession, the conversation around resilience, personal resilience.
Yeah.
And I hear it time and time and time again. I think not to make it's not a direct comparison, but like we're the social workers of the private sector in the sense where we're really dipping into a whole range of things, from cybersecurity to more complex theory around climate, around people, around profit, and what does that mean? And I think you do have to be an activist. I think you do have to show a level of resilience personally. I think you do have to be interested in change, you know?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for your time, for your insights. And that brings us to the end of this podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.